Well, I hope our diagram is getting more and more familiar. If you start getting sick of it, then that means we are finally learning it and it's become part of ours. The liturgy of the Word leads to the liturgy of the Eucharist, which then drives us to the liturgy of life. Last week we talked about what we just completed, the entrance rite, preparing our hearts, taking what we did out in the community, in our families, in our apartments and homes, and bringing it all together to prepare for the liturgy of the Word. Now today we look at what we are about to do, the liturgy of the Word. So, last Sunday morning I woke up to my radio alarm, and there, the first sentence I heard when I realized I was awake was, "The Jewish people are the people of the book." Not a book like this, of course, because in days of yore, they had papyrus sheets that were rolled together in a scroll. And every synagogue had a set of scrolls on which we'd call it the Old Testament, they'd call it the history of the Hebrew covenant, was kept, just like we have the hosts in our tabernacle. Remember the time that Jesus went into the synagogue and they invited him to read, and they handed him one of the sacred scrolls, and he opened it up to the passage of Isaiah, and he said, and he read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." Reading of the scriptures was of the essence of the synagogue service. And they always started in their first reading with the most important part, and that was either from the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which is the Torah, the basic revelation of God to his people. And the way the scroll had it, there were no, as we have today, chapter and verses. It just went on and on and on. And so in order not to get confused, the person that was reading had a long pointer. And that pointer, they went along like this. Well, actually from the bottom right, because Hebrew starts on the bottom right and goes backwards and upwards. And that's how they'd read. Now, there were no stops or starts, so it could go on and on and on, and people could start yawning. That never happens here, but back then in those days. So what they would do is when they'd see that everybody needed a little break, they'd then introduce a psalm verse. Today we call it the responsorial psalm. It broke up the long readings and it became a devotional way of reflecting back. Then the second reading was normally from either the prophets or the wisdom literature. Now, remember we had where Stephen was stoned, the first deacon, taken out of the city and stoned, and no longer did the Christians feel safe. And so what they did is that when they celebrated the Eucharist, they brought along the custom of the synagogue service, and this was how the liturgy of the Word got joined to the liturgy of the Eucharist. Only what the Christians would do is, instead of the most important first, they would start with normally an Old Testament reading. So one of the prophets, especially you hear so many times, a reading from Isaiah and Jeremiah. You know, you hear those big prophets and then smaller ones. Then the second reading is with the responsorial psalm. Then the second reading is normally a letter from St. Paul. And you'll notice it's continuous. So one Sunday you'll have letter, chapter 1, a section from chapter 1 of St. Paul to the Corinthians. Next Sunday you'll have the next segment. And that may go on for 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks. And then it would go to Ephesians and so forth. That's how we do that. That is a continuous reading. Then we stand for the gospel. So it's opposite from the synagogue. We go from the Hebrew covenant to the most important reading, and that's why we sing an alleluia, an acclamation to say, tune your ears, folks. Jesus is about to speak to us. And so we have our gospel, and we begin by making the cross on our forehead, our lips, and our heart. May the Lord be in our brain, in our mind, on our lips, and in our heart as we hear the word of God. Next, of course, is the homily. Now, I don't want to tell you this, but I will. There's 3 parts of the homily. The first part explains either the seasons or the scriptures. The second part then takes it and brings it to our day. And if it works, there's a connection. So if you hear something that's just very old-fashioned or something from way back there and you understand it, but you walk away saying, what's that got to do with life? We probably missed the mark. Because it's to match how God spoke, what our situation is today, and how do they match together. Following the homily, then we do the creed. I believe in one God. And that is to say, we're not just St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. We're not just 2015. That we are part of a 2,000-year development of what God has revealed to us. So when in the creed, then, we become part of the greater church, saying we believe in Father, Son, Spirit, and that church. And then comes the petitions, or the general intercessions. And the general intercessions are petitions that are there to talk, to pray to the Lord, because he's spoken to us for leaders in church, leaders in society, for great needs of people, and then for our own personal needs. And what I like to just give you an example, if you have an aunt that has a sore toe, you don't just pray for my aunt that has a sore toe. You pray for all of those who have sore toes, and especially for my aunt. In other words, they are general intercessions that bring the greater needs of the community, which may include an individual. So now, let's hear the word of God.